Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Chekow-Lusignan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. FFRPL raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. We welcome you to Books Sandwiched In. We ask that you please silence your cell phones at this time. Our thanks go to those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers and artists who so graciously share their time and talents with us, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and the thousands of people who attend each year. We have just a few announcements. We've extended our Library Giving Day promotion through the end of the month to recognize National Library Week, which is held April 23rd through the 29th. If you make a donation to FFRPL of $5 or more today or through the end of the month, you can choose a free copy of one of the 3 beautiful coffee table books you see displayed on the front table of the room. Donations can be made online or in person at FFRPL's bookstore in the space just adjacent to this auditorium. Funds raised with this author will be applied toward the Harold Hacker Advancement of Libraries Endowed Fund. FFRPL will then offer grants to eligible libraries from across 5 counties for projects that further education and professional development for librarians and library staff, and further innovation projects and programs. Please note our Book Sandwiched In review for next Tuesday, April 25th has been canceled. Next Thursday, we'll host the awards ceremony for FFRPL's annual Sokol High School Literary Awards. FFRPL has sponsored a creative writing contest for Monroe County High School students since 1958. Our 2023 event will be hosted here on Thursday, April 27th from 4 to 5:30 p.m. in this auditorium, and it is free and open to the public. No registration is necessary, and we'd love to have you join us. Today is Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, which marks the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The date is both important historically and relevant to today's book review. Yom HaShoah commemorates the lives of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust between 1933 and 1945. The Monroe County Library System holds approximately 2,400 items related to the Holocaust, including books, visual materials, video recordings, DVDs, audiobooks, books on CD, large print books, Blu-ray, music CDs, ebooks, a Holocaust Studies annual publication, a musical score, and even 2 Braille titles. You can visit rockcitylibrary.org to browse the collection online. The Monroe County Library System includes the libraries of 16 towns, 2 villages, a school district, and the city of Rochester. Today's book review is of the title 100 Saturdays, Stella Levy and the Search for a Lost World by Michael Frank. 100 Saturdays is a portrait of Stella Levy, one of the last remaining Holocaust survivors from the Sephardic community on the Greek island of Rhodes. And our reviewer today is Monica Gebel, Director of Community Relations for the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester. Please join me in welcoming her to our podium.
Hi, everybody. Well, I love that this is going to be interactive. Do you agree that this should be interactive, that I hear from you as well? Good, because I used to be an English teacher, and I don't want to have to call on anybody. So I'll tell you a little bit about me. As you heard, my name is Monica Gebel. Like Susan, I last night was at the Jewish Community Center to commemorate the anniversary of Yom HaShoah, the Day of Remembrance, but it was also the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And if you're not familiar with this piece of history, often Jewish people will hear, why didn't Jews fight back when the Nazis came for them? Why weren't there any secretive operations? There actually were, and they've been left out of history. So a little bit about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is that it was, first of all, that Warsaw, being the capital of Poland at the time, also housed 30% of Poland's Jewish population, which is quite significant. And I'm not going to get too much into history because that is somebody else's specialty, but there was an uprising that was headed by two gentlemen who were in their formative years and who decided that they wanted to die on their own terms, that if they were going to be pursued by the Nazis, that it was up to them to really take matters into their own hands. And so if you want to read a little bit more about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, that's something I can give you some notes about a little later after this talk. Mordechai Anilevich, who is the name that we associate with that uprising. And last night, Susan and I got to hear a wonderful professor speak. He's pretty well known in the Jewish community. His name is Michael Dubkowski. He's a history professor locally, and he got to speak for about 45 minutes about the uprising. But really what he was talking about were different forms of revolution or pushback or uprising. And I think those are some of the things that I want to point out in this book today. I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be Jewish during a time of persecution. And we'll talk a little bit about Stella's story as well. But the first thing I think I'm going to do, I think I told you I was going to say a little bit about myself. I always pass over that part. AV mute, there we go. We'll see if this works. While this is coming to life, I'll let you know that I am a third-generation survivor. That means that my maternal grandparents survived several death camps. How they survived, we don't have access to. I'm not really sure. What did I do wrong? I'm sorry. In my mother's house, my grandparents didn't really want to talk about survival. They didn't want to talk about the past. They just wanted to talk about the present. And so when I was growing up, I went to a Jewish day school, and I remember my grandparents coming to some of our chorus concerts, and my grandmother would look up and say, "Take that, Hitler. We're still here." So, there was still a very deep-seated resentment, anger, emotional turbulence, turmoil around having survived. My grandmother was the only survivor of her family. She lost 4 siblings, both parents and 2 sets of grandparents, of course, extended family as well. I think one paternal cousin survived, and he wound up in Paris somehow, but we've lost contact with that side of the family. And my grandfather, who I called Zaidi, which is a Yiddish word for grandfather, he lost 5 of his siblings. They were a family of 7 kids. His maternal grandmother lived with them in the house. Everybody died except for he and his brother Max, who made their homes here in Rochester. And so I was fortunate to know some of my cousins, but it just meant that I had very little family growing up. Oh, my laptop went to sleep. Well, everybody deserves a nap once in a while, I suppose. And now I can press. Oh, there it is. Okay, great. So now you know a little bit about my background. And when I was asked to read this book and be a part of today, I was so honored. But I had no idea what I was about to look at, as I'm sure you didn't either. Because how many of us are familiar with this teeny tiny island that looks like it's closer to Turkey than to Italy, and yet was colonized, right, by the Italians. Mussolini took it over. Again, I'm no historian, so really what I know of this area, I have had to learn from this book, and now I will probably start looking more into the Sephardic culture of Greece and Rhodes. But before we get into the meat of the book, it's really important that we all have an understanding of what being Jewish means. I know that's huge, right? It's a big, loaded question, but if I were to ask you, what does it mean to identify as a Jewish person? And don't worry, there's no one right answer. What could that possibly mean? What is being Jewish? Go ahead, you can call out. I'm not going to send you to the principal, because you can call out in this class. What is it? Right. Exactly, right? So being Jewish is a religion, exactly. And your name? Phil, excellent. Right, it's a culture, it's an ethnicity. There are languages that identify Jewry, as Stella expresses that her family spoke Ladino, which is a Spanish-influenced Yiddish. There's so many languages. We can get into that later. Somebody might be born Jewish. I took a 23andMe test. Has anybody done this? This is crazy. I wanted to see if I was really who everybody said I was. And my ancestry 23andMe test came back and said, "You are so Jewish." They're not lying. You are 99.9 something % Jewish and also a little bit Spanish Moroccan. Well, cool. That means that I can eat rice on Passover. Right, so it said that I'm 99% Ashkenazi, which means Eastern European Jewish, and the 0.01% Sephardic, which I find really interesting. So being Jewish encompasses a whole lot of different parts of how we identify ourselves. And I think that's important when we talk about Stella. So, as I said, the first thing I'm going to do is look at, with you, the 1938 racial laws that were put in place that affected Stella's life. And I'm going to hop around here and there. Luckily, I remembered my reading glasses because I just became of that age where you hold things either here or here. So if you have the book, this is from chapter 37. Halfway through the third evening, Sarfati, who is one of Stella's elders, he's Italian, and he has taken Stella under his wing, comes to 1938 and the years immediately following. And here's a researcher, Sarfati. In the fall and winter of 1938, the racial laws were promulgated. Only one public protest against the racial laws has surfaced in a magazine published in Torino. In Napoli, in September of 1938, street cleaners found little pieces of paper that said, "Stop racism." That's it. So I'll stop for a second because you might be wondering how Jews could be considered a race. They still are to some, right? If you ask a white supremacist, are Jews white? No, of course not, right? So Jews began to be racialized in the turn of the 20th century, but folks like Hitler and Mussolini really took these ideas about blood and soil and ran with them. So in 1938, we've got racial laws that affect Stella in a myriad of ways, both positively, which is strange, and negatively, of course. Jews were fired from all public employment as soldiers, bus drivers, librarians. Jewish actors and performers were expelled from concert halls, theaters, film companies. Their names were expunged from recordings. Jewish lawyers, physicians, and midwives were expelled or limited as to their work. Jews were barred from being street vendors, hotel keepers, circus artists, stationers, vendors of Catholic sacred objects. In 1938, and remember, the war doesn't officially start until September 1st, 1939. So this is pre-war. 1938, A Night at the Opera, which, if you've seen it, is pretty good. It's a Marx Brothers film from 1935, was banned. And in 1938, all traces of Judaism were stripped from schools, teachers, students, Jewish authors, mentions of Jewish authors in reference books. Spinoza, for example, was no longer mentioned. Spinoza's a famous philosopher. Marx, Einstein, and Freud were wiped from textbooks. Publishers stopped printing new books by Jewish authors, and older books by authors like Henri Bergson were confiscated and withdrawn from the market, and of course, as we can all imagine, eventually burned. Okay. So I would love to have some feedback from you all about that passage, which, by the way, are not Stella Levy's words. This is a historian to whom Stella is listening in an auditorium, and this author, Michael Frank, is sitting behind her and watching her have reactions to all of this information because she has lived it. So I'm kind of curious to know, because we have such a great group here, what does this make you think about? Oh, you don't have to raise your hands, but I love that you, okay.
My former wife, it wasn't just Europe,
Right,
the United States as well.
right,
My former wife's father could not be admitted to medical school in the U.S. because all medical schools had already reached
the quotas.
and he ended up going to Edinburgh and Scotland for medical.
Oh, that is wild,
He
right.
came back, and by the time he came back, was drafted as an officer, medical officer in the U.S. Army in World War II.
Look at that, interesting. And ironic, isn't it? If you couldn't hear that, and your name, James's former wife's father could not apply to medical, or couldn't get into medical school in the United States because the medical schools here had already filled their quotas, so to speak, with enough Jews. So they could only take so many. That's interesting. And later he serves in the United States Army in World War II. Okay. Right, yes, the United States did play quite an interesting role in the beginning of the war, but that's for another time. That's another book talk. Okay. Wow. Right. Right. Wow. Oh, that's interesting. Right, right. And your name is? Joan was just reminiscing about her mother, who was born in 1915 in Western New York, telling you about the sterilization of girls who are mentally handicapped or who are developmentally different, so that girls to do farm work. And the question you asked is so interesting. How does that transfer to Jewish people? How is that sort of limited understanding of humanity transferred later to Jews as a people? I don't even want to begin to answer that, because look at the history of the United States in dehumanizing people. We are a country built on slaves, the backs of slaves. So dehumanizing is in the DNA of the country, right? But, right. And so we can start to question the history that we were taught as children. That's really insightful. And I saw a hand over there about what these racial laws were reminding you of, or what it brought up for you. It's all connected. Your name is? Laura, thank you. So, right, I was hoping that, and you all spoke beautifully about this, that there are so many connections to what is happening today. It's a little scary, isn't it? And I want to revisit that in a moment. Book banning. Exactly. What are we so afraid of when books are banned? You know, I was just in the tunnel between both parts of the library, and somebody's painted beautifully a stack of books that are probably banned. I know one was just recently in a school, maybe in Pittsburgh, was almost banned, and it's called "This Book is Gay." No, the board did not like that. They did not like that title. Not that it's come to me through the grapevine that the people who wanted to ban the book hadn't read it, right? But that's okay, right? Because, all right, there's like a limitation of understanding. Okay, so we've got book banning, erasing parts of history, erasing people from an entire profile of the arts. And we can make enormous connections, and several connections, to what we see happening culturally today. Forget about politically, but culturally, without mentioning politics, we might look to what's happening on campuses, whether college campuses, whether they're K through 12 school districts. There are some really vocal people who don't want to see parts of gay identity, LGBTQ, Black history, etc., being taught in the classroom. So I go back to Marcia's question. What are people so afraid of? Well, what we're dealing with in 100 Saturdays, what Stella's family is dealing with, is not just erasure, it's elimination, it's extermination. Stella has a very interesting growing up. While she's learned Italian, she's mastered Italian now because she understands that culturally that means survival. But I told you that I would look at with you, now I have to find my notes, how people rebelled in small ways. Where was the revolution? Where was the resistance? So I'm going to read this part, and I'm not sure I really put together until last night that there was resistance until I revisited this. One day, not long after the racial laws went into effect, Stella went to check out the new arrivals in Barbara's bookshop, which stood outside the Juderia, the Jewish ghetto, but was still within the city walls. The local library at the Dante Alighieri had been closed by the new laws, depriving everyone in the neighborhood of access to books. That left Barbara, which was staffed by Rosa Galante, the Tres Simpa Venus, who was still able to work for the moment, despite being Jewish herself. Stella didn't have much money to buy many books, but she did love to look at them. Gone with the Wind. Talk about an ironic book, right? Thanks, Margaret Mead. Not exactly historically accurate, right? But she loved Gone with the Wind, the latest novel from Hungary or Italy or France. In the bookshop this particular afternoon, also browsing, was a thoughtful man, thin, older, as in his early 30s older, whom Galante introduced to Stella. And his name we come to know is Luigi. He's a professor of Italian literature at the boys' school. They start to spend more time together, right? And he asks Stella what she's doing about studying now that she can't go to school anymore. She's not allowed to go to school. She says nothing. Reading, I guess, writing, though I would like to do more. Standing there among the stacks of books, Stella and Noferini, Luigi, spoke for a while, and then Noferini made a proposal. What if, he said, he were able to put together a shadow school in the afternoons when he had finished teaching? He and maybe also a handful of colleagues could meet in secret with the Jewish students who were interested in pursuing their studies so that they may stay on track for, the future, because nobody knows what's going to happen. So interestingly, Stella begins to study under the auspices of this shadow school. I love the name. And one evening after the second lesson, he asks Stella to stay behind. Stella, he told her, you have a very strong brain, but you have to promise to work hard. It would be a pity not to use it. You have to be prepared to keep up with the work we're going to give you, because this war will end soon, and all this anti-Semitism will go away, and then you will go to university. I know it. Do you promise? I like that line. All this anti-Semitism, like this nonsense, will go away. Okay. To me, this is an important part of this book. And I wanted to make sure that we keep this lens in mind, because otherwise, it's very easy to think of Stella as a passive participant, right, in the Holocaust, that it happened to her. And it did, and it happened to her family and several others. And we remember that on this island where the computer went to sleep, let's see if I can bring it back. On this island, this sleepy little island that not many people have heard of, there is a thriving Jewish culture. Thriving, and not just religiously, right? But she talks about food. She even talks about clothing rituals that I'd never heard of before, because I'm Ashkenazi, I'm Eastern European. She talks about food I'd never heard of before. She talks about friends and how they studied and what they know of Jewish scripture and all of these different ways of being Jewish. And yet, one of the most Jewish things about Stella is that she continues to want to read and study. So we've heard about Jews as people of the book, right? People of the Torah, people who like to argue over scripture and text and what things mean. This, I find, is an inherent value of Stella's that she has inherited over thousands and thousands of years of Jewish ancestry. And given this invitation, she grasps it. And what I love even more is that this Luigi, maybe he's not such a looker, but they develop something very special. I love that she says in the book, you know, in that time we didn't have to sleep together to have a nice romantic relationship. I love that she points that out. But she says there was something really special. He put his hand on hers, and she knows that he's there. He's not Jewish, but he is there for her. And he becomes embraced by her family. So I'm going to pause just for a moment in case anybody has feedback or you want to ask a question or there's something you wanted to respond to. Sure. At this point, 15. So very impressionable. You've just seen a photo of my kids. I have a daughter who's now 14. And I think about any of us could think about what would we do? What would we do with our children? Who would we be at 14 or 15 years old? Would we have the wherewithal to say, yeah, I really do want to keep reading. I want to keep studying. This is something I bring up with my kids when they say, no, I don't want to do homework. And my comeback is, Malala always wanted to do her homework. No Jewish guilt there. But I might as well also say Stella wanted to keep reading, right? Later in the book, she tells us that for all of the studying she did, she still felt like a failure later in her life. She studies and studies and studies, and finally she is allowed, she's admitted into this great room to take an enormous test that determines the rest of her academic life, and she says she freezes in that room. She can't open her mouth. She can't say a thing. That is an interesting moment. And I'm no psychologist, but I have to wonder about that moment. She's in a room full of young men who are taking the same test, and she can't do anything. And she says even after she moves to New York and raises a family, in her moments of joy, she goes back to that moment and feels like a failure. She's failed her life. Again, this intrinsic desire for knowledge, for always achieving academically or grasping intellectually, that moment determined so much for her that even as an older woman, she feels that she's failed herself and her potential. That, to me, is also intrinsically Jewish, that it's an academic moment. So again, any questions before I move on? And how much time do I have left? Okay. Excellent, okay. I just also wanted to acknowledge Stella's mother, Miriam. She's so lovely. She's such a force in this book. And she's such a beautiful defender of her family and her daughters especially, and Stella. That Stella is not just hanging around with one older Italian man, then it's two older Italian men, and then it becomes there's another man in the picture. It's her mother, who could be very, very conservative and traditional, who might say, you cannot be seen with those men, and instead says, we don't care what the tongue wagging outside of our home is all about. My daughter is fulfilled. She is happy. There is a war going on. She is a teenager and she feels intellectually free and she feels socially fulfilled. What more is there? What more could we ask for in the middle of a war? I just thought that was beautiful. And so Miriam becomes one of my favorite people. I can't call her a character. She's not fictional, but she's somebody that might inform the way I parent my kids, right? Let them talk. What does it mean to be a child in the middle of a war? And what does it mean to be a child growing up in the environment where we are seeing boards or groups trying not only to ban books, but as I'm sure you're all aware, last summer there was a group that wanted to come to Rochester's Armory. It was under the guise of Christianity, which we know is not real Christianity, but Christian nationalism, to denounce immigrants or migrants, to denounce people who don't speak English, to denounce people who have different skin color, and the list goes on, and not the least of which were the Jews who control everything. The anti-Semitism, the racism, the Islamophobia, the list goes on, I don't have to tell you, is alive. It's as alive and well to me as a parent of young kids as it ever was for my grandparents as teenagers. So with that, I hope that, if you're not done reading this book, that when you go back to it or you reread it or you read it to somebody else, that you bring where you are in this culture to Stella's story. And I hope we get to talk about it a little bit more after today. So thank you for listening. Thank you so much.